All right, so for this class, we're going to take what we built the last time, which is, I'll remind you what it is in a second, but we got a reference to our hello world text view, and then on a button press, we altered that. And so what we're going to do is do the reverse. So I'm going to show you how to do an edit text, grab the text out of that, and then put that into a text view. And so it's all these buttons work almost exactly alike. So for your homework, it was edit text, which you've never used before, but you want to understand that, again, whether it's an edit text or a text view or a button, they all kind of work the same. Obviously, a button will have slightly different functionality, but in terms of getting a reference to them or just the way that you interact or maybe get the text or set the text, all those are pretty much the same. So you'll see that the API for Android is very consistent, and they've improved it over the years and got rid of any inconsistencies, but it's pretty powerful. So let me remind you what we've built last class. So not a whole lot of code on the screen, but we'll get there. So let's pull up our emulator here. Okay, so this is really, really tiny. Let me try to make it bigger. Kind of got to grab the corner. The issue's reading that as well, so you might actually want to make it a little bit bigger. We'll deal with that probably later, probably not today, but okay, so last time I stuck this button in the layout was right above the text view. The text view was centered both horizontally and vertically using constraints, and those constraints are constraining it into that place. But when we drop the button on there, even though we dropped the button right above that text view, it, as you can see on the screen here, just kind of shoved it up in the top left-hand corner. So we'll fix that today as well. But as you remember, if I hit the button, if I tap on it, it changed from, I believe it said hello world to hello again, which is what we have here. And so just as a reminder, we get that text view because we want to manipulate it. We want to mutate it in some respect, and the way that we're going to do it is we're going to change the text of it. And you can programmatically add these things and do a whole bunch of other things once you get either reference to it or you create it in code here. So again, I'm just getting it the find view by ID. That's the way that we get our views from our layouts. And again, the layout is defined by this line of code here. So set content view, this is what Android Studio automatically creates for us. And we're going to get the views ID. And now this is a templated function. It's going to pass back, hopefully, a text view. And we would probably do best to check for null and make sure that it is coming back as that. I believe the compiler would just say, hey, this text view or this ID doesn't exist. But it's also likely that that ID doesn't exist in that layout, because this might be a valid ID in some other layout, but not a layout, not our activity underscore main layout. So do be careful of that, and do be careful of what you are naming your views IDs. So in this case, it's hello underscore text view. I like to append text view or whatever type it is afterwards, so hello button. And that way, as I'm doing as I'm typing it in, because I have two that are called hello, and if you remember when we type in hello, I get all of my kind of custom IDs that I've created. And so you can group these by different views. And so maybe if you have a view, like an add view to add some kind of data, or an edit view or something like that, you can give it the view's name and maybe add or edit. Yeah, question?
In the video, I knew that part was cut off where you actually named it. Could you show where that is?
Oh yeah, perfect. So so this was a button. Let me put that back. And again, just to reiterate, I like to put the type, whatever view it is, at the end. That way, just because there's so many different views, and when you get mixing views, it really helps to know that this is the hello button versus the hello text view versus whatever. Okay, so the question was, I guess in the live stream this panel got cut off here, so hopefully that's fixed on the current one. Okay, so I gave these IDs to these buttons, to the views, and it was in this little attributes panel here. And if you don't see this, if it is minimized, you hopefully will see an attributes little tab here, and that will expand it. Okay, so there's that. And then for the ID itself, there's hello_button. And if I change that, then my code will break in the main activity Kotlin file. So we added this button. We gave it an ID so we can reference the button or the view from our code back to the layout. And if you look at the hello world or hello class text view, there's the ID for this one. So hello_text view. This is a kind of like a label, or if you've used any other platforms or frameworks, this is how we want to present text. Yeah, go ahead, question.
So those springs went away when I was like messing with all the little hover the mouse over the box thing. I was wondering how to get those back, if possible.
Yeah, so the question was, he got rid of these springs, the constraints on this. That's all controlled here. I personally don't really like constraints. We'll show you how to lay out this interface a little bit more appropriately in a second. But yeah, that's if somehow that got messed up here, then that's what these guys are for. This
Okay.
Yeah, so we'll get there in a second. Okay, so again, ID back to our code, so _text view. And so these two lines of code allow us to get a reference to our view in the layout and then be able to manipulate them. So in the first case, for the text view, since I have a reference to it called hello text view as a value, meaning I can't reassign a value to this variable anymore. So if I tried to do something like something like this, copy that right afterwards, it'll give me an error saying that you cannot reinstantiate or reassign to this variable because it's a value and not a variable. So if you ever want to change the value of it, then change it to a var variable. We'll go into those in a second here, but that's the syntax of this. We have what's called an implicit declaration or type declaration. So the compiler will know that this particular variable is of type text view because, well, it's smart like that. This one is a button, but I'm being explicit about it, saying that this value button is of type button, find view by ID, and find me a button within that. And so I'm being very verbose there, and you definitely don't need to be that verbose, but sometimes I just like to put it in there because depending upon what you're trying to do, you might have to, and so it's just easier to do it right off the bat. But I'm showing you both ways of doing it. This warning might actually, sometimes it just tells you to get rid of that that part there. Okay, so all right. So again, once we have the reference to button, we can set a on-click listener, and this is pretty much how you always interact with buttons. Set an on-click listener, what happens, what code gets executed when you click on that button, and we're going to change the text of that button. So nothing fancy yet, but let's do one thing before we dive into a little bit more code. Let's go back to the layout, so activity_main, and I'm going to fix this button because it's kind of, there's where I put it in the layout, but obviously based on our emulator, it's up there in the top left-hand corner. So one of the easiest layouts to work with is going to be a linear layout. So right now it's on a constraint layout. If I click on that, you can see that there is a blue rectangle surrounding our view, our layout here. And that's going to be the parent view, and anything nested under it, namely these two guys at the moment, these are going to be contained in that. And so you can have nested layouts within layouts. You can organize these layouts however you want. We'll do that in a second, but it is a hierarchy. So if you want to put something, put a button from one layout to a next, you can drag it here. You can also sometimes drag it here, though I don't like to work too much within this because once you get a whole bunch of widgets on the screen, sometimes grabbing these is really, really difficult as it gets cluttered. So always go back to the component tree if you have the opportunity. And as you select the component tree, it also selects it on the layout here. And then on the right-hand side, you have all the attributes for it. We'll get into each one in detail, but let's first fix the layout. So the first thing I want to do, as I mentioned, I want to do a linear layout. And a linear layout is kind of how it sounds. It'll lay out these buttons or widgets in a linear fashion, whether that's vertically or horizontal. So the easiest way to change this, back in the day, I would go into the XML. I would take the layout, which is right up here. Support, constraint layout, has all these different namespaced attributes on it. And here's the end tag for it. And then again, with everything within it is a child of that layout. So I go in there, I would delete this guy, I would change it to a linear layout, and then it has another attribute for horizontal versus vertical, et cetera, et cetera. And then you also have to make sure you change the end tag, and that's obnoxious. So not recently, but fairly recently, sometime after that, they changed it where if you just right-click on it, you can go to Convert View, and I can convert that layout to a number of different layouts, including the linear layout and a relative layout. We'll talk about those later, but again, kind of the easier one to work with and conceptualize is the linear layout. So let's go ahead and apply that, and you can now see that instantly our layout changes, and if you can guess, it's a horizontal layout, and you can know that by looking at the little gray text here. It's kind of small, sorry, but linear layout, horizontal. How do I change that? Well, you can go into code. I'll show you that that long line of code in our XML that got changed down to just linear layout, which is not hard to do manually. Sometimes if I'm having trouble with the linear layout, I will go into the XML and just edit it there because sometimes I can't find the attribute in the right-hand side or whatever. I can't find it. I like to have Code Complete help me out. So if you type in like Android, you can get kind of a list of all those. So sometimes, again, if you have issues with it, you can try that. Okay, so where is my... Okay, so it did not add a specific attribute. I think it defaulted to horizontal. So I'm going to go back to the design, and linear layout orientation is none. So that just means that I guess by default, if you don't put in one, it goes to horizontal. If I set it to horizontal, obviously nothing changes. I actually want to do vertical. And that's fine for right now. We'll kind of clean it up in a little bit, but yeah, so now I have my class here, and then it's all vertical. What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually add another layout nested within this layout that will be horizontal. So we just go to Layouts in our palette, our widget palette, or UI palette, whatever you want to call it. And so here we have our constraint layout, which is what we defaulted to. We have a guidelines. We can put in these nice little guidelines. Another linear layout. This one is specifically horizontal and vertical. Obviously, you can change these. If I put in a horizontal, I can obviously change it to vertical, which is what we just did. So I'm going to drag this in, but instead of dragging it in here and not really kind of knowing where this is going to go, I'm going to drag it in the hierarchy. So I'm going to drag it in the hierarchy. Now everything disappeared because what's happening is our linear layout, if you can see, I don't know if you can see that, especially on the live stream, there's a blue mark that surrounds our view. And that's going to be the dimensions of that child linear layout. So we have two layouts, two vertical ones, and they're nested. And the child, this guy here, its layout width and its layout height are set to match parent. I don't know if you can see, there you go. So match parent, which means it's going to shove everything aside, which it just did, and fill its containing parent. So this is kind of one of the things in Android where you get a little frustrated because you don't know what just happened, and you can now edit, undo, and go back to the way it was. But really what happened was these two buttons, or these two widgets, the text view and the button, became siblings of that layout. And that layout comes first in the hierarchy. So again, it's going to try to expand itself to fill its parent or match the parent's dimensions, both the height and the width. And that's going to be at the cost of these other widgets. So make sure that if that ever happens to you, just kind of go back to the component tree like I said, and just make sure everything is there. Now if I drag this down, you can kind of play around with this. As I drag it down, it's going to be parented to the first linear layout. And now you can see that our hello text view and our button are showing up in that order. So again, since it's a vertical layout, this comes first, that comes second. If you want to reverse the order, you can try to drag these around in here, but sometimes it doesn't quite work, as you can see. Okay, that worked. But yeah, it's kind of clunky a little bit. There you go. My favorite way of doing it is just dragging it around in here. Much easier. You can kind of see what you're doing. Okay, so we're just going to have the button below it, so I'm going to do that. All right, so now we have a linear layout that's going to take up the rest of the parent. So our hello text view is going to be up there, and then our button, all obviously horizontal. And then the rest of the view is going to be taken up by our layout. So that's kind of how that works. If I want to stick that button underneath this, I just drag it, make sure it's hovered over it and not, like if I drag it to the left, it's now going, or it's going to be still parented to that first linear layout. If I drag it up over this child linear layout, it'll go up underneath, and you can kind of see that child linear layout now kind of moved itself up, and then the button became a child of that. So hopefully that makes sense. But again, this will kind of give you a little bit of a headache as you're trying to lay out widgets, and especially as you try to refactor stuff. This gets a little bit messy just because sometimes it'll not work as expected. Okay, so that's kind of the gist of it. Let me let's see. Let me see if I can clean this up a little bit. What is this? The linear layout. I'm going to change this over to a horizontal, and I'm going to have two buttons. So I'm going to go over to buttons, drag in a button, and I'm going to add it below the hello world button because I want it to the right of it. And you can see, oh my God, it took up, I don't know, 4/5 of the screen. Why is that? Well, there's a layout width, or excuse me, a layout weight. And the layout weight for the first button doesn't exist. So if we type in 1 for the weight, and if I click on the second button, you can see both layout weights are the same. So when they're both weighted equally, if that is not too obvious to say, but if I change the second button to a 2, what it does is it kind of adds up all those weights and then takes it as a percentage of the weights that are in that layout and kind of figures out how big that button is. And so it doesn't get too small. If I do 9, you'd think that the left-hand side button would be super small. It kind of doesn't like squish it too much. So do be careful when playing with that, but I do want it to be equal widths on that. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is I want to make sure that my buttons all have IDs. It's just good practice, plus you can't do anything in code without a proper ID. This one has the default of button, which is not very descriptive. I know it is a button, but which button is it? So from the homework, the first one The first one, I believe, concatenates the two edit texts, and then this one adds it. So I'm just going to simply do add, and maybe I'll just do hello add button, something like that. You can camel case it. That's usually the proper way of doing the IDs, but I don't know. Do it either way, I guess. Doesn't really matter. Yeah, question.
Is there an easy way to hide things in that preview menu? Like if you wanted to make one of those buttons disappear just in the preview, is there a way to do that?
You mean just here?
Yeah, like if that button was in the way and you wanted to work on something under it, like in that window, is there a way to make that button like hide it?
So if I understand your question, you just want to make it invisible?
Just in the preview window. Okay.
Like that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like I don't want it to be selectable. Like if you're in Photoshop, like if I disable the layer so I can't actually see it anymore, but it's still there, like that's what I want to do.
Okay. If I set this to invisible and I run the application, that button will be invisible.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if there's something below it, well, I can still select it here. That's why I said go back to the component tree if you want to select it. Like if you want to select something below it, like a background. Yeah, usually backgrounds. Most of the time you don't want to stack your UI elements on top of each other, but like, yeah, if it's a background that you want to make as an image and you want to select it, but there's buttons on top of it and UI widgets on top of it, I would just go back to the component tree. You could, yeah, this won't make it not selectable. It's not like...
That just, like I want it to still, when I run the app, I want it to still show up, just not when I'm in that preview.
Oh, okay. You want like, yeah... Not that I know of, honestly. Never needed to. Again, it's just go back to the component tree if you want to select things around. But yeah, I've had that where I've needed it, and like you'll have overlays where it's like a dark. You like want to do a light box effect, and you want to darken the background, and so you put that on top of everything. Now that's the thing that's on the top of your UI elements. You want to select everything from the back. Yeah. How have I done that in the past, besides going back to the component tree? Yeah, I've done all sorts of things like drag it out of the way, which is obviously not a good practice. So let me think about that, and I'll come back to you. But off the top of my head, I don't think there's a way to do it. I could be wrong. This is the very simplified attributes menu for this. If you want to view all attributes, well, click on the View All Attributes in the bottom right-hand corner, and then you get all of the attributes. And so sometimes, as I mentioned, I sometimes can't find attributes in this long list. And I've scrolled past it like 3 or 4 times. And I'm just like, just go to the text and do it that way. So how do I get back out of this? Click on this left and right arrow at the top right-hand corner here. And that'll give you back to the simple view. I would say about 50% of the time I end up going to that all attributes, depending upon what I'm doing. But yeah. What I should also add to the visibility, so I can make it invisible, which obviously makes it invisible. But if I choose the option gone, actually let me switch this back to none. I'll do it on the first button. So I'll switch it to invisible, and obviously makes it invisible, as I said. If I switch it to gone, watch the button on the right-hand side. It pretends that that's not part of the layout. Okay, so I'll do that again. Invisible. Invisible still takes up its space. It's just invisible. Okay, so if you don't want it to if you don't want it to change the layout, or you want it to still be there and maybe make it visible via code, you can use that option. And again, gone makes it gone. It takes it out of the hierarchy of the layout, and the layout restructures itself. Yes, question in the back?
The button's still clickable if it's invisible?
No, I do not believe it is. I've never. Well, I shouldn't say that. So the question was, is it still clickable when it's invisible? I want to say no. Try it.
I know that there's an attribute called is clickable.
Yes.
So you have to set if you want to, so whether or not it is by default.
Yeah. That is used for other views that you can click on. So you can make like an image, a button, and that sort of thing. So he's talking about the is clickable attribute in there. So yeah, you can disable a button that way, which is somewhere in this nice long list, I'm sure. But Yeah, and you can set that programmatically. Usually I'll set that kind of thing programmatically. So for instance, if I'm filling out a field and it requires first name, last name, email address, password, and all those fields need to have values in them, once those fields get values, then I'll say, yes, enabled true, or something like that. All good questions. So let me fix this. I'll just change that back to none. Okay, so obviously I get off on these tangents, but they're good tangents. So I'm just want to make sure. Oh, here's the onClick. Oh, that's code. Sorry. Let's see. Okay, so what I wanted to do, first of all, I'm going to change this button to concat. In your homework, I kind of left those vague on purpose because I want you to be more creative. You don't have to be, but if you want those extra points on the homework assignment, then go ahead and be more creative than concat. I'm going to change this one to add. Okay, so that's the text. That's obviously what the button is showing so that your users can understand what those buttons do. I'm going to clean up this a little bit. So I can't select that UI element. I misclicked, so I'm just going to select it in the hierarchy here. And then I am going to, it does not have the attributes on here. So I am going to go show all attributes, and let's talk about margin and padding. So if you're familiar with HTML, CSS, this should be obvious to you, but because it works the same. But for those who are not, let's cover this really quickly. So the margin is going to be the space outside of the UI element. So you can add margin to the bottom. If I type in 10, these are going to be 10 dips or density independent pixels. And what that essentially means is a density independent pixel is about 160 pixel per inch screen. It's going to represent 1 pixel. What you need to worry about is when I say this is going to be 10 pixels on the bottom, I'll do that again. Actually, I'll increase it to 50. You can see that everything's shifted down. Okay, so everything shifted down below the hello class text field there. But the dimensions of it are real tight against that text. That's margin. So margin is everything outside. And if you're really curious, the way that Android renders this is it renders the layout first. It doesn't care what the content is. It only cares about the content after it does the layout. And so that's why layout is, the name here is first. So what does that mean? Well, it's a little bit more complicated, but just know that it gets rendered, the layout, everything that's in layout gets rendered first in case you're having some issues with sizing. And then inside, after it's rendered, then it goes to padding and then does that. So let me just show you what padding is first. I'm going to select, let's go down to bottom. And I'm going to add another 50 dips there. And you can now see that the actual dimension of it, the text view is padded with 50 pixels. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. If not, we'll be covering this many, many times. But the density independent pixels are really powerful because what you see on this screen is almost guaranteed to show up on another screen because they're going to be independent of the resolution. So that's a nice thing. If you've ever dealt with resolutions before, it's kind of a nightmare. This fixes it for the most part. Okay, so I'm going to clean this up a little bit. I'm just going to give, let's say, 50 pixels all around on the margin. And for padding, I don't know, I'm going to put 10, oops, for all.
Can you do percentages?
Yes, but no. Don't do percentages. The question was, can we do percentages? Yeah, you're thinking too much of HTML and doing it that way. Try not to think that way. If you need to do something like that, use the layout weights. So like if I have more than one element in here, I can do the layout weight and just set it that way. That's not quite a percentage, but it kind of works in that manner. Cool. Okay, so let's see. I was gonna do that. Clean that layout up a little bit, and then what else was I gonna do? I should have.
You said that we need to worry about something as far as the 50 dB goes.
Say that again with the wording.
Worried about? You were like,
Oh, yeah. So really, just think about it this way. If you are designing for a tablet versus a phone, you don't have to worry about the fact that the tablet might have a higher pixel density than the phone, or vice versa. So, for instance, when they had when they came out with 1080p TVs that were like 42 inches or whatever like that, I was like, oh wow, 1080p, that's really cool. But it was like, well, my phone does like 1280. So it had the same number of, actually had more pixels. My phone had more pixels than a 1080p screen. However, the density of those pixels was varied widely. So as you know, the phones are really, really tiny, and the TV was like 42 inches measured diagonally. So the density independent pixels, these dips, when I say 50 dips, that will show up pretty much the same on a TV as it would on an iPhone, a phone, Android phone, depending upon the density of those pixels. And so again, you don't have to worry about resolution. Back in the day, if you've ever done like game programming or anything visual graphics wise, you'd have to get the resolution of the screen and then divide it by a certain number in order to get the ratio, and then use that ratio to show, okay, I want my character to be maybe 1/6 or 1/10 of the screen size, right? So 10 characters tall would be the screen size and the height. So anyway, there's a lot of calculations that you would have to do normally, but the density independent pixels handles all that for me. So just ignore it. But oh, sorry, say again. Metric? Yeah, it's still a measurement. Is that your question?
Like if you had a 2K with a 1440 as opposed to a 1080, you did a 50 dB, it would still look like the same kind of ratio.
Yeah, so if you had a 4K TV and you had the same thing on 2K, now there's a difference between screen real estate and resolution. So the resolution would look, or let me get my terminology correct, it would match it. So it's kind of hard to explain without showing it to you. And you can actually, I won't do it now, but you can, maybe next class, I'll create a virtual device, an Android virtual device that's a tablet, like an Nexus 10 or something. It's a 10-inch screen versus a Pixel, which is, actually Pixels are almost those size these days. But you can just see that you have a little bit more screen real estate on the tablet than you have on the phone. But in terms of how these buttons match up, everything will kind of be the same ratios. As I said, it's kind of complicated. Don't worry about it right now. That's what I said initially. Don't worry about it. We'll get there, and we'll explain it kind of a little bit later. But test it out, see what it does if you are curious. Create an Android virtual device with a tablet and see how they look. You get more screen real estate, meaning I'll have more vertical or horizontal space, but the buttons won't look like absolutely gigantic on a tablet. That's pretty much the sum of it. But good questions. Thank you. Okay, so let me get back to what I was doing. Okay, I'll move on because I was going to do something else to clean that up. Let me make sure that this looks decent. I was going to center and everything, but we'll ignore that. Okay, so again, we're going to have some edit text. I'll add those later. The two buttons are going to concatenate the two edit texts to get together, or they're going to add them together. And so how you want to handle that is really up to you. Some people will just ignore it until you put actual numbers in there to add together, or people will just concatenate it together without a space, or you want to add a space, such as a first name, last name. So get creative with it. I purposely made that vague. But let's talk about Kotlin a little bit. So I have numbers versus strings. So I kind of threw in numbers at you without really explaining how to handle those. So let's say we have a value age, and it is an integer. And so I'm just going to, age 100. Pretty old, but it's an integer. I guess you can be like 100 and a half or whatever, but for the most part, they're integers. And then we're going to have, let's say, a salary. And a salary is going to be a double precision floating point value. And let's say I make, I'm going to put a interesting number in here. 33,030 cents. Okay, so that's the difference between an integer and a double. You probably knew that already, but we want that decimal place. Now, if I have another one called benefits, I'm not going to explicitly put a type on this. I'm just going to say benefits is equal to my age times my salary. That's a pretty good benefit. We'll get there in a second. I want to log the value. So I could put this in the text view and do this. So I'm just going to log the value because I want to show you kind of how to do some debugging. So log D is going to stick it out to the debug log. We have other log options. We have the error log. We have, let's see, let me go through these so I don't have to remember them off the top of my head. So debug, error, information, which is I, V for verbose, I believe, W for warning, and then we have another one helpfully titled WTF. I forget what they say this is supposed to stand for, but it's pretty much what you think it's supposed to stand for. If something's not working in your application, you're like, what, and you can put this tag in here and say, I forget what they. I looked this up one time. I was like, okay, what does it mean if it doesn't mean what you think it means? And it's some awkward thing that they kind of shoehorned in there, and just to make it not so explicit. Anyway, so we're not going to use that one. We're just going to use debug. So D, and then it's going to ask for a tag. The tag is just a nice way of searching for this debug statement. And I'm going to type in BSU. Obviously, type in whatever you want. Do make this unique, because we're going to search on that string. BSU tends to be pretty unique in terms of output stuff. And then you put your message in here. So I'm going to type in benefits. And you can see that benefits is a double. And remember, I didn't put that in explicitly. I didn't say, hey, benefits, you are of type double precision. It's just going to be age times salary. So when you're multiplying an int by a double, it's going to upcast that, or excuse me, downcast that to a double, because a double has more information than an integer, right? Because it has the decimal points on that. So the compiler is smart enough to know that benefits is going to be of type double. If I try to explicitly say, no, that has to be an int, then I'd probably get an error or a warning saying you need to, you'll get truncation. I forget what it actually does. Yeah, question?
What a terrible failure.
What a terrible failure is what it's supposed to mean. Officially in the documentation. I looked it up in the documentation one time. Yes, what a terrible failure, but I don't know. To me, WTF means something else. Anyway, so in my code complete, and by the way, if code complete doesn't come up, you'll probably see this happen many, many times during this class. If code complete doesn't come up, it's probably because you have some kind of syntax error above it. So yeah, just that always comes up. All right, so I typed in benefits. I'm going to get an error because this function expects a string. So how do I put a variable in a string? Well, two ways. I can simply, this is a double type, but it is a fully, it's a first-class citizen in terms of being a class. It's not a basic type like it is in Java, C++, C, and pretty much every other language besides Swift that I know of. I'm sure there's other languages that do this. It is a full-featured class. And so because it is a double, I can do things like toString here. Okay, and that'll satisfy the fact that it's going to take that double integer or double precision floating point and make it into a string. And let's go ahead and just run this. I'll show you where this gets output to. from my Android virtual device. Okay, running. Let's make sure everything is here. Okay, there it is. And it didn't pop up my, usually it pops up my debug window here. So go to logcat, which is down here at the bottom. And you probably will see something similar to this. If you just started your emulator, you'll just get a whole bunch of just output stringing and spewing all sorts of garbage that you probably don't understand. Most of this is of that nature. Because I put in this tag BSU, if I type in BSU, it's not case sensitive unless you want to make it, and make sure that this drop down is verbose. If I go to debug, you can see that it is d/BSU, which is the debug / and then the tag, and you can see what's being output here. Now this is kind of a funny thing, but if you guys know anything about floating point values, even double precision floating point values, is they're not exactly precise. So even though they're doubly precise, you can see that there's a little trailing whatever value at the end of it, because 33,030 times 100 should not give me any decimal places. It should just be 0, 0. However, again, floating points always kind of have these little imprecisions attached to them. So never, under any circumstances on any language, Java, C++, etc., even Kotlin, ever compare directly two floating point values together. So if you do like if floating point is equivalent to second floating point, never do that. And this is why, because you get these little pieces of garbage. And that's just how they're represented in memory. So anyway, yeah, if you're like, why aren't these numbers equal? Print it out to the screen, see why, and there you go. Okay, so moving on. Let's say I want to type out a nice message. I could do something like, if you're used to Java, either doing a string builder or something like that. My benefits this year, something like that, and then you might concatenate those together or something like that. But that gets really messy really quickly, especially if you're trying to do like periods, something like that. Ugh, ugly. So instead, just put it inside of the string, and this is called string interpolation. And instead of doing benefits just as a normal string, I can do a $, and that'll print it out as a string. So I can even get rid of that function at the end here. Okay, so we'll run that really quickly, and then we'll move on to the edit texts. Yeah, these are the types of things that'll kind of trip you up, is typecasting, getting values to, especially strings, to be integers. Like I'm going to type in a string and I want that to be an integer. We'll get to that in a second, but okay, so there we go. My benefits this year. Now that kind of took a long time to compile, reinstall the APK or the Android package onto the emulator and then rerun it. So I'm just going to change, let's say, just going to change this to that string. I'm going to save it just because I'm going to apply these changes. So somebody mentioned this, where the apply changes is for the hotfix type stuff here. So I'm going to hit that, and it's a lot faster. So you can see almost immediately it comes in and says this is the new output. So if you want to change code really, really quickly without having to recompile your application and rerun it, you can go to this little apply changes. So that's where that is, just to bring that out. Now, if you want to do that like toString or some kind of complex functions, by the way, well, Android Studio did that for me automatically, but you wrap it in curly braces. So you can do like complex multiplication or some kind of addition in there, or any kind of operations in there. So I'll leave that on there. Okay, so let's get to the meat of the homework here. So I need edit texts. So these edit texts, you can, if you know what type of data is going in them, such as a phone, an email, a password, then you can use these kind of convenience, but they're all pretty much the same type. And so I'm going to drag in just a plain text, and let's drag this into somewhere after this. Okay, this is going to get a little messy, so bear with me for 2 seconds. So I'm going to drag that in here and then drag another one in here. So I'm going to take these two edit texts and concatenate them together. So give me a new ID for this. Let's say, let's just do first name. And it is of type edit text. Click on the second one, change the ID to, let's say, last name underscore edit texts. Change the, okay, so the text here, let's get rid of that because we don't want the user to have to delete. So they're going to select it, then they're going to have to delete the text that's already in there. So you can put in like a, let's say there, let's see, first, or sorry, delete that one and then do first. Actually, I'll just get rid of that. I'll show you that in a second. Okay, so those are our two edit texts. I think I laid those out appropriately. They should be in that vertical hierarchy. All right, so we have our first button here. I've added a second button, which we'll get to in a second. I'll just show you how this works, and then you can guess how the second button works. Yeah, let's keep that in there. I'll post this to the repo so you have all the source code after the homework is due, of course. Okay, first I'll get a reference to this. So value, let's say first name edit text. This is going to be of type edit text, r.id, and we called that first name edit text. I'm going to copy that. I'm going to paste it down here. I'm just going to change this to last name edit text and change the ID for that. Okay, so again, just getting the references to the two edit texts, and then on button click, I'm going to have a new value called name, and I'm going to be explicit about it just to show you this. So first name, and you might do something like first name, last name, edit texts. But again, these values are actually references to the UI elements in the layout. They're not actually text, so you just have to get the text out of them by doing dot notation dot text. Okay, now I have the name here, so I'm actually just going to replace that. Obviously, you got to put it after that. Here. Oh, let me. Okay, so these are texts. So I'm going to do string interpolation to just make sure that this is formatted. Get rid of that. Sometimes Android Studio is not helpful in adding those in there for me. Okay, so adding, this is my concat button, and I'm just putting a space in there between the two edit texts. Again, you can do whatever you want. If you want to concatenate, or I don't know, be creative. I'm not going to come up with anything off the top of my head right now, but so I have this one. Again, I'm just concatenating these two strings together, and then I'm putting it onto the hello world or the hello class text view. So let's run this really quickly. Go back to my emulator. Okay, so this will be first name here, last name here. I'm just typing on my keyboard, obviously. You can type on this keyboard. Now, as I mentioned with the different edit texts, if you're dragging in like an email address or a password, not only is that going to change, for example, if it's a password, these characters to a dot, but it'll also change the keyboard. So for example, if you chose the email edit text, it'll have the little @ symbol and a couple other nice things to, couple keys that it makes editing or adding an email a lot easier. If you're doing like a web address, sometimes they put in like a button for .com. So again, if you're help out your users as much as possible by choosing the correct keyboard. It frustrates me to no end when a developer doesn't, like, it's asking for either a URL or an email address, and it doesn't put that @ symbol in there, because then I have to go to the symbols and I have to hunt down, etc. Anyway, I'm going to hit concat, and here we go. First name here, space, last name here, etc. So that's pretty much all you have to do for homework 1. Now for add, I'll leave you with this. I won't show you how to add those because there will be a little bit of homework that you have to do. That's the name. But I will show you this. So I have a string. Let's say name is of type string. And it's going to be, I'm just going to say name. How do I get that to be an integer? Well, I don't, okay? You have to try to make it an integer if you want to. So you can do name to int. Okay, and let's assign this to name int of type int. Okay, so this is my attempt. If you were grabbing the string out of an edit text, for example, and you wanted to make it into a number, you would do something like this. However, it's not going to work in this case because name is not a number. But give this a try, do some error checking on it to see if it's appropriate, and if not, handle it in your own way. Make it a 0 if you want to, make it a 1, make it whatever. I just don't want your application to crash. That's the main thing. Because if you tried to do this and you just accepted whatever I typed in was a number, and you tried to do toInt on a number, and you tried to use that value, it would crash. So above all else in this class, don't have your applications crash. So I expect a little bit of error handling, which is why I kind of threw this at you, where I want the two edit texts to be used both as strings and as numbers, or whatever you want. It has to add it and it has to concatenate it. What I can also do, let me get rid of this explicit declaration of the type, and name, let's say name is not a name, but it's, oh, I don't know. I already said age. I'm being really creative today. I'll say year. Okay, so year is currently 2019, but I want to add it as a string. So maybe you're accepting this as an edit text. And again, edit texts will give you a value of string, but obviously I want to make that into an integer or something that I can maybe do something useful with. So I can do dot notation on this string and say toInt directly on the string. Now that's kind of weird. Why don't I just say 2019 as a number? Well, again, if you're getting this from an edit text, you can do a toInt on it, and again, just error check it to make sure you have that. But even numbers have this is an integer, but let's say it was 2019.1. You can do some interesting things in Kotlin. But let's see, let's go back to where I had. Control space on the Mac will pull up autocomplete if it goes away. I'm not sure what it is on Windows, probably control space as well. Give it a try. So I can just see that the compiler thinks that year is an integer, and that's to be expected. That's what I want, but you can always double check to see what it is that way. Okay, so hopefully that gives you enough information on how to complete homework 1. You should be able to get the text out of it. If it's a string, then obviously you can just concatenate it. For your other click listener, it's going to be probably a number, so you can just again use that toInt or todouble or whatever it is, the type of data you're trying to get to, and then add those using the plus operator or the addition operator. Any other questions before I let you guys go?
I have a question.
Yeah, question.
With your emulator, is there like a better way to exit? Like, should there be a best practice for exiting out of that thing? Like, it seems like when you hit the power button, it kind of goes into sleep mode. But is exiting it just is that when I exit it and then I reopen it, it seems like it just is left off where it just opens up right on top.
Yeah. So the question is, if I shut this down, it closes the operating system, and then when I open it up, it has to boot up again. Yes. The simple answer, the quick answer is If you go up to your Android Virtual Manager, your AVD Manager, these are all of them. If I go into Edit for this device, I'm going to try to see where this is. I guess it's under Advanced. Here. So under Emulated Performance, you can select the boot option to Quick Boot. There's also a save state somewhere, unless they changed it on me. But I think that's what you want to, choose from snapshot. That's not selectable because of your graphics mode, I believe. If I change this to, I think, hardware. I forget how to re-enable that. The quick boot option will allow you to boot that quickly. So for mine, if I close it, you can see it'll save state. And then if I relaunch it, let me cancel out of that, press play. Well, it pops up almost instantly, but if I had an application running, it would also pop up as well. So again, in your AVD, pop this up, show advanced settings, and quick boot. If you have issues, sometimes I've had issues where the Android virtual device does not start at all. Open it up, go to cold boot, hit finish, reboot it. That will reboot Android, the operating system on your emulator from scratch, and that sometimes kicks out any issues that you have. Yes, another question?
Instead of just going into the settings, you can hit the arrow, right, that down arrow, under actions,
Oh, okay.
and then there's
Oh.
cold boot. Now,
Yeah, okay, cool. So yeah, this is a shortcut to rebooting it. Cool, thank you. That's learn something new every day. Appreciate that. All right, guys, have a good one. I'll see you Thursday.
See you tomorrow.